Hello and welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. I'm your host, Mark Philpott, and on today's show, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to a live sporting event. The country is Japan. The event is the Rugby World Cup. The stage is the semi-finals. Today, England play the New Zealand All Blacks, and tomorrow Wales play the South African Springboks. It's been a long time since I caught up with my friend that I'm going to be speaking to today, who's over there in Yokohama, Japan. It's a very warm welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show, Morgan Park. So Morgan, welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. How are you today?
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be with you from Yokohama Stadium in Japan for the first semi-final of the Rugby World Cup 2019.
Mate, we've got less than 1 hour to go until kickoff time, and a lot of things I want to discuss with you before we get on to the actual match today. You're an Australian, so you must be feeling a little bit hurt, mate, by going to watch these two teams play today.
You know what? It's one of the weirdest feelings I've ever woken up with on the morning of a big rugby test match. I usually feel like I've got a real stake in the outcome when the Wallabies are playing. But of course, today's match is between England and New Zealand. So as an Australian, it's probably the most difficult combination of teams to work out who you're going to support. Do we support our good old cousins across the ditch in New Zealand, or do we go for the motherland? Tough choice.
It sure is. But listen, let's get back to that game first of all from last week. And the Wallabies, and some people would say they're a little bit unfortunate, but also a bit unorganised. What was your thought about the way England took on that match and actually came over top of Australia?
Look, I think what people have recognised is that the Wallabies are a little bit like an amateur golfer. You're going to have a good hole or a good shot every now and then. It's going to keep you coming back, keep you feeling a bit enthusiastic about your golf game. When you hit that perfect drive every 3 or 4 holes, and then you have a shocker the next one. That's a bit where Australian rugby's at the moment. They're a great team when they're on, and they can literally beat anyone, as a number of other teams such as Ireland and Scotland and Argentina and France all now share that characteristic. But they really lack the consistency to challenge what is an exceptionally well-prepared, well-coached England team who really benefit from having the greatest number of resources available in the world of rugby. English rugby is exceptionally well funded, great player base to choose from, a very professional club system in the UK. And I think Eddie Jones, as their coach over the last 4 years, has done a wonderful job really building on the strengths of what has always been a great set-piece team, and added to that as dimensions that really now present them to the world as legitimate candidates to win this World Cup.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you know very well that this is a travel podcast show, and the reason I wanted to have a chat to you today was not only do we share this passion in common for rugby union, but we also share a passion for travelling. And I'd like you to share with my listeners today, what's it actually like travelling to a major sporting event somewhere in the world versus going away on a normal travel experience for a holiday or for business?
Look, I'm someone who's lived in 9 different countries around the world and visited over 120 countries. But more and more, I love to combine travel with major sporting events. In fact, I was only just mentioning to someone earlier today that some of the most favourite trips that I can recall in my life have been punctuated by sporting occasions, whether it's going to the West Indies to watch Australia play cricket, whether it's going to Monaco to watch a Formula One race, or indeed watching my beloved Wallabies on their Northern Hemisphere tour every November, which I've done for the last 10 years. When you are able to combine travel, which to me is really one of the cornerstones of life, is experiencing different cultures and different places, different cuisines, different languages, taking on the challenges of being in a foreign land. And when you combine that with major sporting events that capture the imagination of the world and bring people together really in a joyous environment where we get to see the best version of humanity at play in sport, in competition. Yes, it's professional, and yes, there's a lot at stake. But for fans, there's a great feeling of joy and camaraderie that to me really amplifies what travel is actually all about. And that's about people coming together as humans, that we share this planet together, and that we can all hear and listen to each other and bring our stories from wherever we've come from and come together in a common purpose.
Yeah, exactly. That's brilliant. Now, you're standing outside the stadium at the moment, there in Yokohama, which is, for people who don't know the geography of Japan too much, it's about a 30-minute train ride south of Tokyo to the seaside city. It's the second largest city in Japan. What's the feeling? What's the hype like there around this tournament? Have the Japanese embraced it, and have you come across a lot of other nationalities since you've been there who are rugby fans?
You know, look, it's amazing. It's the first Rugby World Cup ever to be staged in the Asian region. And I think Japan, has done a fantastic job, and a lot's been said about that over the last 5 weeks or so. Of course, with Japan hosting the Summer Olympic Games next year, this has been looked at very closely by organisers as to how the logistics and so forth are working of just making these big global events actually function. Expectations are high, of course, of rugby fans that have come from around the world and have perhaps been at these tournaments before. And of course, the weather has not been easy with a typhoon hitting the tournament a couple of weeks ago. So all in all, Japan's done a fabulous job. I think what's carried the day ultimately has been the people of Japan, their hospitality and their positive vibe is a really constructive backdrop for other nations to come here, feel that they're welcomed, feel that they're in a really positive, happy environment. The Japanese aren't afraid to wear their heart on their sleeve and get behind their team, and also dress up and really embrace the whole festivity of the moment. And it does feel like a festival here outside the stadium today. There are people from all over the world wearing their country's colours. It's not just about black and white today, as we're going to see on the field in a moment. It's about people sharing some time together. There's literally tens of thousands of people enjoying the food and beverage around the stadium. Everyone's got a smile on their face. It's quite euphoric.
And most importantly, what's the weather conditions today? There's been a lot of rain in the last 48 hours. Has that cleared up for today?
Yeah, yesterday in Tokyo was wet. It rained for about 12 hours. And of course, everyone was quite nervous about today. I woke up this morning in Tokyo and drew back the curtains in my hotel room. I looked outside to a beautiful blue sky. And for the most part, it's been that blue sky right up until now, local time, coming up to 5 o'clock kickoff. There's some dark clouds above the stadium. And it's created a bit of apprehension. It's got a feeling of that sort of tense feeling. It's a little bit darker, but still no rain, importantly. So I think we can expect conditions to be ideal for rugby, ball in hand rugby, and running rugby today.
Let's get on talking about the game itself. The two teams playing today are arguably the two top teams in form in this competition. And it's pretty hard to separate them in a lot of different ways. What's your gut feeling telling you as you're about to walk into the stadium on who might have the edge today and why?
I've got Tana Umaga, former All Black captain, walking right past me. He's got a big smile on his face. I think the Kiwis are pretty happy at the moment with the way in which the team has been building towards this all-important game. It's well known that England and New Zealand both anticipated this being the permutation that would unfold for the semi-final. So it's not a surprise that they're here playing each other on this day. I think that we've got probably the two best teams in the world. Certainly the current World Rugby rankings put New Zealand at 1 and England at 2. So for many people, this is the final today. And whoever wins this match has got a very good chance of going on to next week and lifting the Webb Ellis Cup. So I think most of the crowd feel that New Zealand are favourites. It's very hard to enter a game against the All Blacks feeling that you've got the edge. But equally, if anyone does have the edge at the moment in the world of rugby, it would be England. We know that Eddie Jones is a very clever coach. He's always got something up his sleeves. and to bring out, and we don't know what that is right now, but we will soon. And I think that the English team have got the package to really challenge the All Blacks and put them under pressure. We know that All Black teams rarely lose, but when they do lose, it's usually as a result of a sustained 80-minute performance where the opposition are able to force the All Blacks into mistakes through sustained pressure.
Mm. Do you, as a Wallaby who's encountered many a strong All Black team over the years, do you see this team any better or worse than the 2015 World Champions?
I was lucky enough to see the All Blacks play both finals in 2011 at Eden Park and then 2015 at Twickenham. I think this team, it does lack some of the iconic players that will go down in history as the greatest players to ever have played the sport. There are some names in there that have come into the team relatively recently with a low number of test caps. I'm thinking about the two props and the two wingers in particular. They do have, the capability. They've got experience, through the axis of the team with Kieran Reid at number 8 and Aaron Smith at 9, and then of course Beauden Barrett, who's been the world's best player on and off over the last few years at the back. So they've definitely got players that can make a real difference, and by the end of their careers will go down as greats, but they don't present with the same aura of invincibility that a Richie McCaw-led team did.
Mm. Do you think part of the reason behind that is that some of these guys have come into the team relatively new? They've been playing under the radar for a number of years, and Steve Hansen, being the wily old coach that he is, has kept a lot of these playmakers, under the radar for such a period of time, and we've only seen the emergence, for instance, of the strategy to play Mo'unga and Barrett out of position, so to speak. Has that been something that I think will be unleashed today on the English team?
Yeah, I do think it's very much a deliberate tactic, but moreover, I think that in the world of professional sport now, we're seeing form play a much bigger role than incumbency. In eras gone past, it was almost impossible to make your way into a national team because the incumbents were always given that preferential favouritism. What we're seeing now is Steve Hansen adopt an approach of rewarding current form. And in the case of some of these newer players, they've established that form not only at club level in the Super Rugby competition in the Southern Hemisphere, but also in test matches leading up to this World Cup. And one thing we know about the All Blacks is they do have such a robust philosophical framework that when players do come into that All Black environment, they do generally lift. And that's been the case with these newer players. So I don't think he'd be putting them in to a sudden death match like a World Cup semi-final today if he didn't have complete faith in their ability to deliver at the highest levels.
Mm. So you're saying basically an All Black win, but if anybody can beat them, it's an England team.
Yeah, I think that's where I'd land at the moment. I watch a lot of English rugby. I know a lot of these players as they've made their way through to this day. They are a very good team. They have a great deal of confidence about them. But I think generally, based on form and just experience in these big moments, I think that you'd have to say that the All Blacks are favoured. England, the kicking game of England is going to be vital. They are the best tactical kicking game in the world right now, with Ford and Farrell, and also Elliot Daly at the back. They have a real ability to make kicks, turn kicks into opportunities, and it's something that a lot of other teams aspire to do, but rarely can get it right. It's a bit of knife-edge type capability for those people listening that don't know all the ins and outs of rugby. It's a game that is admired for the ball-in-hand approach, but ultimately big games like today's game are sometimes decided by the less glamorous elements of the sport, being the set-piece play and tactical kicking. And England is very, very strong in these regards, and that really puts them in the contest.
Mm. Well, I guess we're all hoping as rugby enthusiasts and advocates over the years that the referee today, Nigel Owens, doesn't play a role in the outcome of the game. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, there's been a lot of criticism of referees playing too much of a role in determining the outcome, and a couple of notable exceptions that I think will be examples of that will be talked about for years to come up to this point here in Japan. If any referee is qualified for today's match with everything at stake, number one playing number two in the world, it is the Welshman Nigel Owens. He is well known for being a referee that understands the spirit of the game and can read the flow of the game, and is not necessarily a letter of the law type approach. And you're going to see him let the game play. He understands how players can get into compromising situations. He understands the difference between the intent and the actual outcome. And most of all, he understands what spectators want to see. So I think games refereed by Nigel Owens tend to be attractive games where the better team can prevail.
We're going to have a chat to you after the game, and whatever the outcome is, I might be happier than sad, but we'll wait and see for that. I'm going to let you go and get your seat in a minute, but just before I do, I want to know a little bit more for the listeners today. What's the atmosphere? How many people are going to be inside the stadium today, and is it really starting to pump up as far as the adrenaline goes? Do you get adrenaline going to these games and start feeling the atmosphere yourself?
Oh yeah, look, I got goosebumps, and I'm not even, I'm Australian watching New Zealand play England, but I'm standing outside the stadium. I've seen a plethora of superstars of our game from the past walk past me while I've been talking to you today, Mark. Everyone is here. Everyone is excited about this game. This is as big as it gets. This is number one playing number two. It's black versus white. It is, and I mean jersey colours, and it is a World Cup semi-final. And there are about 60,000 people here. There's a lot of Japanese, a lot of local support, but also people from all over the world. If I had to say how many jerseys am I seeing of each colour, I'd say that the All Blacks probably have the merchandising war won. You're going to see a lot of black in that audience, and you're going to see some white.
Well, I'm only sorry that I didn't get you your black jersey before you headed off up there, mate, and you could have been wearing that proudly today.
You'd be glad to know that I'm wearing a perfectly grey shirt today, which I think is quite appropriate.
Sitting on the fence. Okay, Morgan, go and enjoy the game, and thanks very much for giving us your time. We'll catch up with you after the 80 minutes is up.
Great to chat.
Thanks, mate.
Enjoy the match. See you now.
So, Morgan, catching up with you after the game, England versus the All Blacks. And I must say, from a New Zealand perspective, pretty disappointing, but at the same time, a fantastic match of rugby.
Yeah, look, what a game it was. An epic semi-final that I'm sure will be remembered for many years to come. The New Zealanders, you can tell by their response to this particular loss, unlike other situations where they've been knocked out somewhat prematurely in World Cups, I think they really acknowledged the opposition and recognised that England had played a near faultless game to dominate from the haka. Even before the game started, there was a real sense that England was up for this contest, and that proved to be true.
So, look, we left you before you went into the stadium. How was the atmosphere when you got inside and just before kickoff? How was the energy in that place?
Absolutely electric. The stadium, there's not a spare seat in the stadium. The crowd was, largely black and white, as you can imagine, reflecting the two jerseys that the country's playing. I'd say that there was fairly equal representation of both crowds, and national anthems were very special. And of course, it was a dramatic haka, the English response to that haka. Then the countdown to the kickoff, and it was just exploded. And then, of course, we saw the first few minutes of the game were just some of the most beautiful rugby to watch that anyone's played. Really, really special.
Now, we can't really get a good gauge of it on TV, as you know, but when the anthems were sung, who had the largest voice?
I think God Save the Queen, it went first, and the English were in great voice. And then God Defend New Zealand was everyone else. Pretty equal, I'd say.
Right.
But both great anthems, and I sang along to both, and as did the people around me. We were the neutrals of the occasion, and of course, in a World Cup, when you get to these latter stages, there's a lot of people from nations that aren't actually on the field contesting. and you sort of get this real international flavour to it, and that really just adds to the occasion, I think.
Could you sing the New Zealand national anthem in Maori?
First few lines, I actually made sure that I got online prior to coming out to the stadium to watch the semi-final, and reminded myself of that Maori language. It's a beautiful words that make up the New Zealand national anthem. I did my best.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll send you the full rendition. So for the next rugby championship next year, you can sing it every match.
I'm happy to.
Now, the English scored pretty much straight away in the match within 2 minutes. How did that make everybody in the stadium feel in terms of, was it a case of game on here?
Yeah, look, I think people were really pretty blown away by the precision, the accuracy of the English play. Everyone was involved early, from 1 to 15. We had forwards in pivot, playmaker positions, and because of the multi-phase nature that led up to that try being scored, I think everyone was sitting on the edge of their seat. There was a very low error rate, especially in the first half of the match. And the teams just looked brilliant on the field, and I was situated in a fairly high seat, so I got to see all of the bodies in motion. It was like a poetic motion, really, watching England score, and the All Blacks just seemed somewhat stunned by how much energy England brought to the contest.
I was going to ask you about that. Was the body language evident of the All Blacks standing behind the post after the English had scored that try?
Well, interestingly, Kieran Reid took the entire team into a tight huddle. They didn't chase the conversion as you're permitted to do. Instead, he got that team together and used that time behind the try line after England had scored to really send the message loud and clear that they needed to regroup quickly. Of course, all the experience in that All Black team was being called upon at that moment. It's not a start that you would hope for a semi-final at a World Cup. And of course, what we saw to follow was required even more, experience to try and navigate through, and ultimately falling short in the end.
We got to half time, and you could say that New Zealand was rather lucky to get a try back into the game and appear on the scoreboard as though they had a chance. But what was your feeling at half time, and what was the mood inside the stadium at that stage?
Well, the stadium became increasingly in disbelief that the All Blacks had been held to nil so long, and I think people around me were sort of reaching for the record books to understand how long has an All Black team been held to 0 in a Test match. Because I can't recall in my life the All Blacks being held scoreless so long. So the longer that it continued, the apprehension increased and the anxiety increased, and we wondered whether the All Blacks were ever going to be able to make any dent in what was a stoic English defence. The All Blacks just appeared to not have an answer to the English commitment, and they just couldn't get out of their own half. We saw them starting to then behave in erratic fashion, and I think what we saw was some of the more controversial selection decisions that we talked about prior to the match really bearing out. And what I mean by that is the selection of a lock in the blindside position and two relatively inexperienced wingers who I felt didn't handle the occasion as well as perhaps a Ben Smith might have, for example.
I think a pretty tough call given the superiority of the English defence and the pressure they applied for the entire match. I think that was, I guess, one of the things that was probably most recognisable was the sustainability of that pressure throughout the whole game. The All Blacks didn't seem to have an answer for it from number 1 to 15, really.
Yeah, in rugby, it's always the case that you'll see momentum changes, and coaches talk about it a lot, and players reflect on those momentum shifts that inevitably happen throughout 80 minutes of rugby. And what we saw in this game was something quite unique, and that was England maintaining a level of intensity from minute 1 to minute 80 that was really, really consistent. It was high pressure, whether they were on the ball or whether they were defending. the ball. They were just up for the challenge every single minute. They just didn't go away. They just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And if I think back to some of the coaches' reflections of other teams that have recently beat the All Blacks, whether it's Joe Smith with Ireland or Rassie Erasmus with South Africa, they always talk about the importance of playing the full 80 minutes and just keeping up, getting up off the deck, making the next tackle, making the next hit, cleaning out the next ruck, and just being relentless in your work rate. That's what it takes to beat the All Blacks. You cannot go off the boil for even just a few minutes because they will strike. And what we saw was England put in a complete, comprehensive 80-minute performance from 1 to 23.
Hypothetical question for you. Do you think the English would have played that well if it was another team other than the All Blacks?
No, I think that rugby is defined by the challenge that the All Blacks present. In many respects, beating the All Blacks is like winning a world championship in another sport. Their dominance in the sport is well known, and every nation considers the All Blacks to be the ultimate challenge. To do it in a World Cup semi-final is all that more impressive. And there's no country that lacks for motivation when they front the men in black.
Now, you talked before you went into the stadium for the game, the threat of some black clouds over the stadium. It did actually start to rain. How long into the game was it when the rain started?
We only became aware of the rain really in the halftime break. The halftime break, England were 10-0 up, and I thought that 10 point to 0 advantage really started to become more valuable as the rain fell. Of course, making up a deficit in the rain is a lot harder than it is in dry weather. So, people were saying, does Eddie Jones have a direct line to God? Because it felt like he had every single element of this context like it was on the end of a string, including the weather.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not obviously a neutral observer here, but I looked at it from a point of view. I've watched the game twice now, and I can really say that through the pressure the English have mounted at every position, the All Blacks' normal handling superiority, which happens in most games against most opponents, wasn't there in the match. And there was a lot of drop balls. But again, this came from the English constant pressure. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw a lot of uncharacteristic things from this All Blacks side in the semi-final. We saw them tackled into touch on 8 occasions. That's something that they pride themselves on, being able to use the full width of the field, but not falling into the mistake of being taken out over the touchline. We saw them put through a lot of what seemed to be fairly wishful thinking type grubber kicks, chips and so forth that are quite uncharacteristic. And, that's a result of pressure. It's a result of trying to find a solution to a problem on the spot, which athletes are required to do. It's all very well for us sitting on the sidelines critiquing their decision-making, but in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the battle, in the semi-final of a World Cup, when you're under the cosh like that, it's very, very hard to successfully innovate your way out of that. And we could see their playmakers like Richie Mo'unga and Beauden Barrett trying everything they could to break the pattern of the game. The pattern of the game was just England swamping the All Blacks, locking them down in their 22. When England had the ball, they were attacking multi-phase, using all of their players, and looked somewhat All Black-esque, if I may say, in their approach. And then when things got a little bit stale, you'd see Ford or Farrell put the ball on the boot into the corner, pinning New Zealand back into their 22, repeat after repeat. And that wears you down, and I think it forced the All Blacks into a lot of decisions that they would probably want to have again.
Now, we're used to the All Blacks having a high-intensity game for 80 minutes in most of the matches they play. Do you think this is a game plan that England can continue to sustain at this level?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? When you play the All Blacks in a semi-final and you're the victor, as England was, the big question in Tokyo now is, can England produce another performance, whether that's against the Springboks or Wales, to go on and win their second World Cup? Look, it's a tough call, but if anyone can do it, it's an Eddie Jones coached English side that will be playing in what will be their 4th World Cup final. And if that's not motivation enough, I don't know what is. So I think England will be very, very hard to beat if they're able to bring that intensity again.
As an Australian, how do you feel about watching another Australian coaching a team that's not his home country to this level of superiority in the rugby world?
Look, having been someone that's lived abroad a long time, I don't have that sort of parochialism in me. I see rugby as a professional sport like many others around the world, where people want to seek out a fulfilling and rewarding career. And I applaud people that take the opportunity to go and coach or ply their trade or work in other places around the world, pitting themselves in the most challenging environments. And let's face, Eddie Jones took on a team that had been bundled out of the 2015 World Cup in the pool stages, the first time in history for England. And he picked the team up off the ground, and he's effectively rebuilt it. So I'm actually very proud of what he's done with that team. The fact that he's Australian is secondary to me. What I admire about him is his professionalism, his work ethic, and his desire to achieve.
Yeah, very good. Okay, last question, last statement about this particular match. When was it on the clock that the crowd kind of thought England have got this in the bag and the All Blacks are just not going to do one of their super comebacks and win this match last night?
There were really three moments of realisation. I think at sort of early in the second half, Steve Hansen started to make some changes. The changes weren't really changing the pattern of all-back play. England was able to deal with the arrival of Sonny Bill Williams, Dane Coles, and people like that, and TJ Perenara coming on. Great players, but they weren't able to change the picture that we were seeing. And so that was the sort of first realisation that maybe England had this. And sort of midway through, around the 60-minute mark, there was another realisation that New Zealand was going to have to score twice to bridge the gap. And they just hadn't looked like scoring up to that point. With Ardie Savea getting over the line after the overthrow on the English line out, there was a brief moment of, I think, optimism and hope that maybe the All Blacks could carry on with it. But that too was snuffed out when England was able to use their superior tactical kicking game to pin New Zealand down in their own half again. So, and then at about sort of 71 minutes, I remember looking up at the clock and looking up at the big TV screen in the stadium and seeing the camera pan around to a number of All Black players on the field. And you could see by the body language that they really felt that it was a bridge too far and that this game had been lost. So, look, it was sort of a slow death in the game. They was just sort of suffocated to death. And so when the final whistle blew and England was the victor, I think everyone was sort of just waiting for that moment to arrive and wasn't surprised by the outcome ultimately.
And how was the feeling in the stadium when that final gong went off and England had clinched it?
Well, the English fans, of course, are great supporters of sport and their nation wherever they go in the world, and they were in fine voice and very, very excited. The New Zealand spectators around me, whilst disappointed, were also very quick to point out that England had been the better team. I think we saw that reflected in the commentary by the All Blacks themselves and their coach, Steve Hansen. And there was a real mood of acceptance and resignation that they had been beaten soundly. And the English, I think, quickly picked up on that as well, and as a result, didn't celebrate in a sort of spectacular way, but in quite a reserved, muted fashion, recognising that they had beaten the number one team in the world, but the job is not yet done. It is a semi-final, and there's the final to come. So, again, I was really impressed with both nations, how they handled that full-time whistle and then the aftermath.
Interesting media comments coming out of New Zealand today and trying to turn this loss into a positive opportunity for New Zealand rugby. There's a bit of a crisis in New Zealand at the moment with teenage level rugby. The numbers of teenage boys signing up to play rugby in New Zealand has dropped 47% in the last 2 years. And that production line that we are fairly used to over a number of generations now seems to be having a lot more competition from other sports in New Zealand. So the mood out of New Zealand today is to say that this loss has actually done something very good to remind New Zealand the passion associated with the game of rugby union and to inspire the next generation to come along and try and win back the World Cup next time. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think Kieran Reid said it most clearly that a loss like this, where you've actually been properly beaten, can be used as a tool to motivate future All Black sides, not just next year in 2020, but all the way across the next 4 years as we look forward to the next World Cup in France in 2023. So, look, as we've seen with New Zealand before, when they have, in their view, underperformed, it does serve as a reminder of what's important to them and the legacy of the All Blacks. And I think it will bring a renewed to innovate union. You've got a new coach coming in for the All Blacks. And with that is opportunity. With change, there's always opportunity, of course. But I think we all recognise now that rugby is a global sport with more nations participating. And whilst it's contracting somewhat in places like New Zealand and Australia with the emergence of football, soccer, and other sports, it's growing really, really fast in some emerging markets. So if we fast forward 20 or 30 years, it's not unreasonable to think that the dominance of any one team can be sustained into the future, where there are more countries participating and more players available. And the professionalisation that we went through sort of 20 years ago is now something that is just happening in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, good point.
And of course, New Zealand has played a very important role in exporting a lot of its coaching talent and player talent to other nations, and it has, as the leader in the sport, has played a leading role in the globalisation of it.
Yeah, good points. Okay, well, let's leave behind yesterday's game, and now you're on your way to the stadium again today to watch Wales versus South Africa. What's the mood about this game, and what's the weather like at the moment?
Look, it's a different feeling here today for semi-final 2 of the Rugby World Cup. There are a lot of Springbok supporters, I'll say that first and foremost, and interestingly, there are a lot of Wallaby supporters. Of course, the Wallabies were expected to make their way through the World Cup, and in fact, many anticipated that it would be Australia playing South Africa today, and tickets are bought a long way in advance. So I see a lot of Wallaby supporters in the crowd that's beginning to form around the stadium. Very, very few Welsh supporters, by contrast, and then a whole lot of international people, as always, at this stage in the tournament. The feeling is not quite as tense, just a little bit less than yesterday, and I think I think what we're going to see is the story, the final final chapters be written in this stage of the stage of the tournament. So everyone's just anticipating who will be facing England in the final.
And do we have a dry track for today, or is there some rain around?
We've got a lot. It's very similar climate to yesterday. We've got some dark, threatening clouds that are rolling in above the stadium. No rain has fallen as yet.
And what's your prediction? Do you think the South Africans are going to have too much firepower for the Welsh, or are the Welsh going to pull another magic rabbit out of the hat and get out of this one as well?
Look, I think it's two contrasting sides. Wales are Six Nations champions. They have played particularly well in the lead up to the Rugby World Cup in 2019. At the World Cup, they have not really fired too many shots. They've been a very, very low error team. They've played very safe, conservative rugby, and that's been good enough for them to top their pool with no losses, and then good enough to see them get past what was a really exciting, exuberant French side in the quarterfinal last week. By contrast, the Springboks have been in a building phase over the last 12 months, building their way through the Rugby Championship, and then, in fact, building their way through the tournament since they've arrived in Japan, facing the All Blacks in the first game of their pool going down in what was a very tough contest, but since then have been building their combinations, working out who their best team is. And I think they've been building very, very nicely for this semi-final clash, a clash that they have been anticipating and I think readying themselves for over the last month. So I really do think that South Africa will have enough. I'm expecting them to play their best game today when they need it. They know what it takes to make it into World Cup finals. They've played a lot of semi-finals over the years. They have a really good feel about them, and they're building nicely.
Now,
by contrast, Wales are in their second or third, maybe semi-final. They've never, of course, won a semi-final at a World Cup. So winning a game today against the Springboks would be historic for Wales to make their very first World Cup final.
Now, in the England All Blacks game, you decided to choose a colour of attire that was fairly neutral. You went with a grey shirt. What have you got on today?
I've got a white shirt on today. So once again, neutral, but also a little nod to the success of England yesterday.
I hope it hasn't got an English rose on the chest pocket, has it?
It doesn't. It's plain white, so it's safe. I haven't gone that far yet.
Now, I had one of my mates who listened to your little piece that I put out today online, and he said for me to ask you today if you're going to be sitting in the same seat as you were yesterday.
I'm actually in a seat that's just 3 rows away from yesterday's seat. So it'll be a similar view. All of the seats here in Yokohama International Stadium are very good. It's a rectangular stadium with some track area at the ends of the field, and for athletics. But it's not your sort of full cricket oval style that we see in places like New Zealand or Australia or the UK. And it's a very steep grandstand, so every seat has a very good view. And we were very lucky yesterday to be able to see the game from a high perspective, where you could really see the patterns of behaviour and how the teams were defending and how they had bodies in motion. And it really gives you a great perspective of the contest that you just can't pick up on TV.
Now, yesterday we talked about the passion of travelling to a major sporting event around the world, and you talked about how they are such joyous occasions and there's a lot of adrenaline flowing. How was it after the match yesterday in terms of just reflecting upon that particular thing that we talked about and just taking in all that amazing feeling of, the All Blacks had been beaten, England played an outstanding game. There must have been a lot of pumped up energy around the place.
People felt that they'd witnessed something very special. They'd seen a team play a near-perfect game of rugby. They'd seen the champions dethroned, and they felt like they were part of history. And I think that people respected the opportunity that they had to be here in Japan, and then proceeded to really celebrate the fact that they're part of the global rugby community. You see people here from all corners of the world embracing each other, talking about the game, and it's just amazing to watch people. There's no barriers. There's no difference. Everyone here is the same. We're equal. We're lovers of the sport, and it's just great to see people of all different persuasions having that commonality. And conversations went well into the night last night. It was a very big night in Tokyo with the Japanese celebrating Halloween on the nearest Saturday to October 31, which was last night as well. So you had this sort of huge excitement across the city. And there are many English supporters that were still out there in the daylight hours of this morning.
Now, when you mentioned talking about rugby, you got back to your hotel and bumped into a famous Australian player from yesteryear and had a bit of a chat with him for a while.
Yeah, we just walked into our hotel and there was David Campese, Australia's first centurion, and a classic Wallaby who played an important role in winning the World Cup for Australia in 1991. One of Australia's greatest ever rugby players, and we just happened to be in the same hotel lobby as him, and of course got talking about what we'd witnessed at the stadium with England triumphing, and wanted to hear his perspective on things. And Campo's never short of an opinion or two, and we ended up spending a couple of hours talking to him not only about the game as it is last night, but also rugby in Japan, how exciting it is to see this country embracing the sport in the way that it has due to this tournament, but also a lot of the interesting challenges for rugby globally and, of course, naturally in Australia as well at this time of change.
Did he happen to share with you his views on the Australian coaching situation at the moment?
Yeah, look, he's David Campese was a Randwick player in his day. Actually played alongside Michael Checker back in the day, the former Wallaby coach. Has a lot of respect for Michael Checker and really understood what Checker was trying to achieve with the Wallabies. Campo spent a lot of time in and around rugby in Australia and around the world, of course, helping out other countries from time to time as a guest coach, and has a hell of a lot to offer. And he's very hopeful that Australia can find a way of improving coaching in Australia, not just at the Wallabies level, but actually right through the system. He spends a lot of time volunteering to help out school children, and he's a big fan of building those grassroots skills. Skills that we've seen on display here in Japan with the Japanese team demonstrating incredible passing and catching skills. Same with England and the kicking skills that England have demonstrated. And I think he's coming from that era where rugby was not yet professional, where players relied less on brute force and power and more on silky skills. Coming from that era, he's a real proponent of skill-based rugby. And he thinks that, a rugby team, whether it's an under-8s or it's an international elite team, can go a long way with excellence in basic skills. And it reminded me of something that's always been said about the All Blacks, is that they do the simple things well. And I think that's where he's coming from, and he hopes that whoever ends up taking on the new Wallaby coaching role has that focus in professionalising our skills and perfecting them, so that then game plans can be built around that.
Yeah, fantastic. Morgan, we're going to let you get along into your seat now and enjoy the second semi-final between Wales and South Africa, the Springboks. And I just want to personally thank you very much for taking time out of your trip to Japan to talk to me and my listeners about what it's like to go to a major sporting event in the world. A lot of people don't get to have that opportunity, and I think by hearing your insights to not only the technical aspects of the game itself, but also the things that you're experiencing of humanity around the experience there in Japan has been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much for doing that.
My absolute pleasure, Mark, and I look forward to chatting with you after this game, and we'll see who's going to be lining up in the Rugby World Cup final for 2019.
So just before you go, who's your pick for today without sitting on the fence?
I think the Springboks will get the job done by maybe 10 to 12.
Okay, well, I'm going to stick with the Kiwis in this one because we've got a coach in there still. We might not have our full team in there, but we've got a Kiwi coach, so I'll go for the Welsh and see how we fall out on that one.
Oh, the best of luck. One of us will be right at least.
Okay, look forward to speaking to you after the game, Morgan.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Bye for now.
So let's join Morgan again for the post-match summary of the Wales versus South Africa second semi-final from Yokohama in Japan at the Rugby World Cup. So Morgan, that was a pretty interesting game compared to the first semi-final. What are your thoughts after watching Wales play South Africa?
As many rugby pundits will tell you, rugby is a fascinating game for one reason, and that's because there's a lot of different ways to win it. And I think what we've just seen is quite a contrast to last night's game between England and the All Blacks. And we've seen two teams who were determined not to lose the Rugby World Cup semi-final do battle with South Africa winning out in what was a call. And it really shows the contrasting styles of rugby. The first semi-final being all about attack and expansive play that's a joy to watch. And then tonight's game being all about defence and strategic field positioning.
So does it frustrate you sometimes to watch a game like that and know that these two teams have a more attacking capacity within their ranks and they don't get to display that because of the tightness of the World Cup fixtures?
Yeah, look, at face value, I think a lot of people go away from a game like tonight's semi-final and feel a little bit shortchanged. But, rugby is a game that has got so many fascinating components to it. There's games within the game, challenges within the challenge. And it's a test match. It's called a test match for a reason. And I think both teams were tested in ways that perhaps surprised some of the fans watching the game. I'm a rugby purist. I love to see teams trying to outthink each other. And I think we saw that tonight with a lot of tactical kicking, a lot of field position, and really stressing each other and trying to apply pressure and choke each other to death. So for me, I got, out of these two semi-finals, I got the best of both worlds. Got a really exciting, expansive match, and then a really tense, tight match. Both required a lot of cerebral thought by the coaching panels and obviously the players playing the matches.
What was the atmosphere like in the Yokohama International Stadium tonight compared to last night?
Well, look, it'd be fair to say that it was a slightly more tempered crowd. People were more engaged in last night's game, and it was louder. And, I think the fact that it was England and New Zealand is due to that. But also the nature of the game we saw last night compared to tonight. This was more of a game where you looked around the crowd and people were sort of sitting on their edge of their seat, tensely watching the match, studying it as each team went back and forth, waiting for that break, waiting for the moment where this game of chess, it was like an arm wrestle where each team was sort of situated right there in the middle, neither team really moving into the ascendancy until the final stages of the match where South Africa came through. So there's a tenseness in the crowd. A lot of people, of course, in the crowd are not sort of people that have seen a lot of rugby, and that's the very nature of a Rugby World Cup semi-final. These sort of matches that come up every 4 years bring people from all over the world with varying degrees of intimacy with the game of rugby. So you could see those people that think that last night was sort of standard fare, looking at tonight's match going, oh, this is a bit different. This doesn't seem as entertaining. And you contrast that with the diehard rugby fans who were just enthralled as much as last night.
Now, out of the group of fans that you talk about over the two nights, you had the English, the All Black supporters, the Welsh, the South Africans, but you also had the Japanese people in the crowd. Who were the most fervent supporters out of the two games that you went to attend?
Look, I think the Japanese have been a little spoiled in the fact that their own nation plays such entertaining, ball-in-hand, expansive rugby. And of course, they love watching the All Blacks. And I think they really appreciated England's performance last night, which is really as well as anyone's ever seen England play, perhaps in history. So we've all been a little bit spoiled with that. The Japanese were probably a little perplexed with tonight's match, seeing two heavyweight nations very strong in the set piece, wrestling with each other in this way. But I think, the most ardent supporters are really the English. They, apart from the Japanese, the hosts, the English always come in big numbers. They're very passionate and proud supporters. And I think they're very optimistic with the way in which their team's playing.
Fair call. How did this particular event rank for you compared to other sports events that you've been to around the world?
Look, I think it's interesting when you take what is one of the world's largest sporting events to a country that is a up-and-comer in that sport rather than an established nation with a pedigree of playing rugby. Japan, as exciting as it is, rugby is not one of Japan's biggest sports. I'd say perhaps is one of their fastest growing sports in terms of participation and spectatorship. But it's really interesting when you get that contrast of a Rugby World Cup in Japan. And I think it's paid off. At the end of the day, sports and people who administer sports are looking to penetrate new markets, to attract new players and new fans and ultimately new sponsors to support the game and the growth of the game. So I think this World Cup, everyone recognised the significance that having it in Japan represents to the global game. So there's a certain amount of deference to Japan. There was a certain amount of respect that was being shown by rugby people, and a recognition that, hey, this is the right thing for our game at this time. If we can build the game's fan base and the love of the game in Asia through Japan, putting it in a time zone which enables so many of the world's population to access it, hey, this is a really good thing. I think you could say the same if the World Cup eventually went to the United States. One of the world's, probably the world's largest sporting market. I'd love to see it go to the United States for exactly the same reason. That it's taking rugby into new frontiers, attracting new people with an interest in the sport, because I just think it's it's the game they play in heaven, as we say.
Now, you've travelled from Australia up to Japan for this particular tournament. What's been so special for you in this trip to Japan, either related directly to watching the games or actually outside of the stadiums?
Look, getting together for sport is an excuse for a lot of people to come together, friends from around the world, to meet up. It's something that I personally have looked forward to for years. I had always intended to come to Japan. For me personally, there's also a special part of it in that I lived in Tokyo for 4 years during my career. So I have very fond memories of living in Japan and working in Japan. So the World Cup being based in Japan was a really special occasion for me to meet up with friends from around the world, meet up with people that I used to know when I lived in Japan, and see the pride that Japan has in hosting an event like this and being the first time ever in Asia.
So now we have South Africa versus England in the final, and many pundits wouldn't have actually picked this particular outcome, but a lot of people would have as well. What do you see happening in the final, and who do you think is going to pull it off?
Look, it's a combination that, all the people looking at the permutations of what might happen over the last few years, this is one combination that had crossed people's mind, and I'm proud to say that over 12 months ago, I put a small wager on South Africa winning the World Cup and a small wager on England winning the World Cup. And they're the only two bets that I placed on this World Cup. And it's just for a bit of fun. So I can't lose come next Saturday. One of my teams is going to win the World Cup. The reason I did that is when Rassie Erasmus was successful in getting South African Rugby Union to pick and make eligible all South Africans, no matter where they're playing their club rugby around the world, I thought that was a really, really pivotal move for that nation. And it enabled them to field a very, very strong team. England, of course, have had such a great run-up over the last 4 years. They've got a track record of winning, and as we say in sport, winning becomes a habit, and that's certainly the case for England. So the stage is set for me. Two teams, contrasting styles. I do think that South Africa will have to play a more expansive style of rugby against England to match it with them. I think most people would be expecting England to win the World Cup, which would be their second World Cup. But you never know. South Africa is a special group of players. They have a whole nation behind them. And I think they play with a purpose that is really hard to match, a level of significance that this team and this sport has in South African culture. And I think that could inspire them to great things. Let's see.
Have you always been a fence sitter?
Look, it's, as I say, I think most people would expect England to win. But you never know. Every game of rugby is different. And a lot of people are saying, based on what we've seen this weekend in the two semi-finals, that it's England's to lose. It'll be a tight contest. People are going to be very nervous. It is the biggest game that you can play in your career. And, I think England should have enough, but don't discount the South Africans. I think they're going to come out and play a very different game to what we've seen tonight.
Okay, well, we'll see how your fence-sitting prediction comes out at the end of the day. Great talking to you and experiencing this event through your eyes and your vision as well. You're a very strong advocate for the game of rugby union, and you have some very strong views that you've shared with us on the show. Outside of this, I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you before we wrap up the show today. What's been your favourite sporting event of all time that you've actually attended around the world?
Look, I'd have to say it's the Olympics. I was lucky enough to attend the 2000 Olympics in my home country of Australia. And, I'm a real softie for the whole Olympic movement. I think in a world like we live in today, this globalised world where we're increasingly recognising the fact that we're all part of one community, the global community. And I think the Olympics for me is sort of the pinnacle of our civilization and our humanity. And I think when the spirit in which the Olympics are contested, the fact that it enables countries large and small to stand on the same world stage, to come into a stadium together representing their country, to be recognised together, I think it's one of the greatest things we have in our world. And the fact that it's a sporting occasion is all the better. And I just love what they stand for, and I love the togetherness. So for me, that would be the standout event because of the meaning that it represents.
Was it extra special because it was in your home country?
Yeah, look, I think for the athletes, certainly, when you hear athletes to speak about their experience as Olympians, the opportunity to perform at an Olympics in your home nation is universally celebrated by those athletes. For me, I love the fact that travel and sport come together. So, I happen to be living in Asia at the time, so it was in a sense for me travelling home to go to the Olympics. But yeah, no, it's very special to see how well that Olympics was conducted. I think there's a lot of, there's views that the London Olympics in 2012 was also one of those standout Olympics. And I think when we look back in history at Sydney, it was really very, very well done. And the impact it had on the city, where people were just sort of pulling together, everyone was in a good mood, and it showed us the best version of what we can be.
Now, look, I've got one last question for you, but I've decided when I've been listening to you to actually change the context of the question. I was going to ask you what's likely to be your next major sporting event that you're going to attend to, but before I do that, I'm just going to say that 2009 has arguably been an extraordinary year in the year of sports around the world. We've had a changing in the guard in the professional cycling ranks of the races like the Tour de France, which are now starting to be dominated by South Americans, which was something previously unheard of. We've seen Tiger Woods come back and win another major in the golf after such a ordeal and absence from the tour, with his well-documented, things that have been going on in his life on and off the golf courses. We've seen the Formula One circus trying to reinvent itself with new owners, and there's lots of things going on in that space. We've seen the likes of Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic continue their dominance in the world of tennis, although some of the young guns are starting to make some headways. So I'm going to ask you, what is actually a sporting event that's actually happened this year around the world that you didn't attend that you wished you were actually at?
Oh, it'd have to be, some of the Grand Slam finals in the tennis, to be honest. I think I've been lucky enough to see those three players that you mentioned, Nadal, Djokovic and Federer play, and at a French Open final I saw Rafa and Federer play. And I just think that we are living in an era, a golden era of men's tennis, that perhaps will never, ever be replicated. Now, that's a big call to say that because no one knows what the future will bring. But the longevity and the quality of these players, when any two of those three, and you could add in Andy Murray, who also incidentally is making a comeback now, when they're playing, you're actually seeing something historic. And I think the Grand Slam finals this year, where those two of those three players have met, has been something very, very special.
Yeah, that's a well-noted one and a good one to pull out of the locker as well. Morgan, it's been a pleasure having you on the show and having this extensive chat to you about not only the rugby union in Japan and the amazing World Cup. We look forward to chatting with you in the future about all things related to sport.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so happy that you're putting the focus on sport and on travel, and it's part of the best part of us being human beings sharing this planet together is that we get events and see the best of our kind.
Okay, mate. Well, I wish you all the best, and I'm sure we'll speak again shortly.
All the best.
There we go. That was Australian Morgan Parker speaking to us live from Japan after the second semi-final of the Rugby World Cup, the match between Wales and South Africa. So South Africa versus England in the final. And we all look forward to seeing the outcome of that. Despite being New Zealanders, we're still interested in the Rugby World Cup. Okay, that's it for this particular episode of the Global Travel Channel podcast show. If you're looking for other episodes that we've done, head on over to our website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. You'll find all of our episodes listed there. Don't forget, you can download them from Apple, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and a host of other locations that are all listed over there on our website. And don't forget, if you really like our podcast shows, why not share them with family, friends, and work colleagues? We like to grow our global community as much as we possibly can. Okay, that's it for me for this particular episode. My name is Mark Philpott. Until next time we meet again, I wish you all bon voyage.